Sometime after sunset on Thursday, October 11th, 1492, a sailor named Rodrigo de Triana, who was serving as a lookout aboard the small sailing ship, or caravel, known as the Pinta, claimed to spot land off in the distance. This was exciting news because it was just about where the fleet, under the command of Christopher Columbus, expected to find the edges of East Asia. It wasn't until about 2 o'clock the next morning that Rodrigo's sighting was confirmed. Columbus's long exploratory voyage from the Spanish port of Palos, and which he referred to as the enterprise of the Indies, had finally borne fruit. Columbus went ashore after daybreak that morning, with an armed contingent, I might add, and planted the Spanish royal flag. In the presence of a notary and other Spanish witnesses, he claimed the place where he had landed for Spain. Columbus's voyage was just one of many attempts by Europeans to find a potential sea route to Asia across the ocean, one that would allow Europeans to tap into Asian trade by bypassing the Muslim-controlled Mediterranean ports of North Africa and the Levant. But why take the risk? What would Europeans gain by reaching Asian markets by sea when traditional routes through the Middle East had supplied the modest European demand for Asian luxury goods for centuries? For that matter, what constitutes a luxury good? And what difference did all this exploration mean to the European economy? Answering these questions requires us to look at a variety of geopolitical factors beginning in the late 14th century, and at ways that cross-cultural contact informed ideas about trade. To set the stage, let's explore the world of Columbus a bit. If we were to situate ourselves in, say, 1450, what would the world look like? Outsiders would have described Europe in the middle of the 15th century as something of a backwater. It was not well developed compared to other parts of the world. China, India, and the Islamic lands to the east each formed world economies, or economic regions that were largely self-contained, that were far more advanced and wealthy than Europe's. Yes, the Roman Empire, a millennium or more before, once had been large and impressive, but its wealth was largely derived from agriculture, and even then, mostly from its possessions in Western Asia and North Africa, not those in Europe. And while medieval Europeans had erected magnificent cathedrals and great stone castles, and even developed some sophisticated commercial techniques, the cities of Europe paled in comparison to the metropolises of Asia. Europe was situated only on the edges of the world commercial system. But I'll ask again, why were Europeans so interested in finding new trade routes? To answer that, let's begin by dispelling a few long-held misconceptions about what prompted European voyages of discovery. For decades, scholars assumed that the advance of the Muslim Ottoman Turks in the Middle East had blocked the traditional trade routes to Asia, and that Europeans were therefore forced to look for new routes to access the East. But even before Columbus's voyage, spice imports to Europe were rising, and prices were falling at the main gateway market in Venice. This was evident by the middle of the 1400s, when Portuguese explorers first started sailing down the coast of Africa. It wasn't until after the Portuguese made regular shipments of pepper and other spices from Asia that the Venetian market collapsed. Another misconception was that Europeans were forced to look to other parts of the world because the continent could no longer support its growing population. Well, it's true that Europe's population was growing during the 15th century, but it would take centuries yet for Europe to recover from its huge population losses from the bubonic plague or the Black Death, which had swept through Europe and claimed a quarter of its population from about 1346 to 1353. Europe's 15th century population was still far lower than it had been at the turn of the 14th century. The best explanation for why Europeans turned to explore the Atlantic, ultimately leading to the discovery of a new sea route to Asia, can be found in the particular interests of states that sponsored voyages rather than in demographic crises or poor economic growth, as scholars once suggested. The fact that Portugal took the lead in Atlantic exploration is curious because it was a poor kingdom on the fringes of the continent. But then again, Portugal is situated at the extreme western edge of Europe. That brought it close to the North African coast. And it was Portuguese aspirations in Africa that prompted early Atlantic voyages. Even earlier in the 1300s, the Genoese on the Italian peninsula, with their Mediterranean orientation, had always been looking for ways to cut into rival Venice's trade with North Africa. And so the Genoese established commercial and financial relationships with Portugal and began limited joint naval expeditions. The Genoese also had commercial outposts in North Africa and likely encouraged Portuguese aspirations in Africa. In 1415, the Portuguese attacked and conquered the North African city of Ceuta in Morocco, just across the Strait of Gibraltar from Spain. Ceuta was the terminus of the African trade routes that brought gold, slaves, and other goods to Morocco. This new possession became very profitable for Portugal and marked the beginning of a series of Portuguese incursions into Morocco. But that still isn't why Portugal attacked. The Battle for Ceuta was one event in a long conflict between Christian and Muslim political leaders for control of the region. Prince Henry of Portugal, better known to us as Prince Henry the Navigator, was keen on expanding Portuguese possessions in the Atlantic islands. And he was perhaps more concerned with continuing his crusade against what Henry thought of as the infidel Muslims. So while it might be convenient to think of the conquest of Ceuta as a strategic move to increase the economic might of Portugal, the best evidence scholars have points directly to religious zeal as the prime motivator. The reason for the battle was a deep religious divide. Portuguese attempts to take Atlantic islands and explore down the West African coast need to be placed in the context of the nobility's crusading mentality at the time. Indeed, historians have identified two motivations that Iberians had for the early voyages of discovery: maximizing wealth and religious zeal. Historians often disagree about which of the two was most important. I think it would be wrong to ignore either or the interplay between both. Anyway, by the middle of the 15th century, a shift had taken place in Portuguese thinking. Due in part to the rediscovery during the Renaissance of ancient geographies that suggested that there might be a sea route to Asia around Africa, finding a new route to Asia became increasingly important. Bartolomeo Diaz eventually discovered the route around Africa in 1488, though he turned his ship back rather than continue on to India, meaning the completion of that voyage would have to wait another 10 years until Vasco da Gama made his famous passage. In the intervening years, the Genoese mariner known as Columbus, who made Spain his home, convinced Queen Isabella of Castile to sponsor his speculative trip west to reach Asia. Both of these voyages, Columbus's discovery of America and Vasco da Gama's expedition to India, brought people from different cultures together in ways that were unusual for their time. While it's true that merchants had been trading goods the length and width of the Eurasian and African landmasses for millennia, this was most often done through multiple transactions, passing through many people. It was unheard of for one merchant from, say, China to travel with his goods all the way to Venice, to say nothing of contact between the Old and the New Worlds. So when Columbus first interacted with the natives of the Americas, and da Gama tried to make sense of the advanced civilization of Western India, their worlds, in a sense, collided. By October 28, 1492, Columbus had been exploring the Caribbean for a couple of weeks, aided by Indian guides. On this particular day, one of Columbus's boats was testing the depth of a river to find a spot for his ship to anchor when two canoes came out. These Indians supposedly told the Spanish, presumably through hand signs, that there were gold mines and pearls on the island. Columbus, as the story goes, understood that large ships belonging to the Great Khan or Emperor of China had also visited the island, and that he was only about a 10-day trip from mainland Asia. It's not at all clear how Columbus got the idea that he was so close to China. It might be that a bit of wish fulfillment was at work in his mind. But Columbus was also interested in establishing trade relations with what he thought were these islands off the coast of China. He spent 2 months exploring the islands, all the while looking for signs that he was close to mainland Asia. On Wednesday, December 26, 1492, Columbus met with an Indian chief aboard one of his ships. When a canoe approached, bearing some pieces of gold that the natives wanted to exchange for a bell. By this point, it was clear that the Spanish really wanted the yellow ore, a useless ornamentation so far as the natives were concerned. A sailor later told Columbus, "It was an astonishing thing that the Christians who were on shore were obtaining the pieces of gold in trade for practically nothing." Whether he knew it or not, Columbus had sailed into a region that was far outside the existing world system of trade as known to Europeans. Vasco da Gama, on the other hand, was well aware that he was attempting to open direct commercial relations between Europe and India. But even this knowledge didn't really prepare him for what he would find. He had stopped at several East African ports along the way where he had some contact with Muslim merchants who were recognizable to him. But India was another matter. And it wasn't just commerce that perplexed the Portuguese in India. The account of da Gama's voyage states firmly that the city of Calicut is inhabited by Christians. Well, this was simply not the case. Da Gama's interaction with the Samarin, or ruler of Calicut, and his staff is instructive. On his second visit to the ruler, da Gama was expected to present gifts. Da Gama planned to offer 12 pieces of striped cloth, 4 scarlet hoods, 6 hats, 4 strings of coral, 6 hand-washing basins, a case of sugar, 2 casks of oil, and 2 casks of honey. But the Samarin's agents who came to inspect the offering laughed at the cheap wares and told da Gama that even the lowliest merchant brought more. Da Gama had, after all, described the King of Portugal as exceedingly wealthy, the wealthiest in all of Europe, which of course was a complete lie. Why then did he offer such cheap gifts, wondered the Samarin's agents. The problem was that da Gama's fleet had a paltry cargo of trade goods. They were fine for commerce in the less sophisticated West African ports, but the value of these things was really quite low, about what a small-scale merchant might bring to a market in Europe. Nevertheless, da Gama bartered some of his stuff for spices with the local merchants of Calicut. His return cargo was very small, but even the limited quantity of spices he brought back were so valuable in Europe that when sold, it covered the expedition's expenses and made a substantial profit too. Da Gama's first contact in India began a centuries-long movement of Europeans into the economies of the rest of the world. The process was messy and often violent. And it wasn't restricted only to the Portuguese or the Spanish. Very quickly, speculators and adventurers from other European countries looked for ways to establish direct trade with Asia too. And this wasn't an easy proposition. Portugal wasn't going to broadcast to the rest of Europe what it had learned over a century of trial and error about the route to Asia. Bear in mind that there were no maps, no data on wind and currents, only scattered reports that were usually kept as secret as possible. But once word got around that it was possible to sail from Europe to Asia, and that a new world had been discovered, everyone wanted in on the action. It was easier for Europeans to follow Columbus's route than it was da Gama's. Columbus had pitched his idea to the rulers of both France and England. So his enterprise was fairly well known in the capitals of Western Europe. Most of the earliest adventurers who sailed to the Americas were trying to find the westward route to Asia. These explorers are well known to most American schoolchildren. John Cabot, an Italian who sailed for England and discovered parts of North America in 1497. And Giovanni da Verrazzano, another Italian, though this time in the service of France, who explored North America's mid-Atlantic coast in 1524. And Jacques Cartier, a Frenchman who explored parts of Canada in 1534. The one who actually succeeded where Columbus and others did not was Ferdinand Magellan, the Portuguese explorer who sailed on behalf of Spain in 1519. Though he didn't survive the voyage, his ship was the first to sail all the way around the world. Voyages like these were important, but they didn't result in opening westward trade routes to Asia, even though that's what they were searching for. So for the time being, Portugal, with its knowledge of the passage around Africa, had a lock on the water route to Asia. Once the Portuguese discovered the new passage to India, Northern Europeans began to consider how they might make it to Asia as well. Though many Europeans followed the Spanish in their attempt to reach Asia by sailing west, this did not stop them from seeking an eastward passage. The English, for example, considered that two possibilities existed to reach Asia. One was the supposed Northwest Passage, around or through North America. The other was a Northeastern Passage, around Asia, or over the North Pole itself. An Englishman of Italian descent named Sebastian Cabot, who was John Cabot's son, bet on the second route. In 1551, he and a group of merchants founded an expedition organization they named the Mystery, Company, and Fellowship of Merchant Adventurers for the discovery of regions, dominions, islands, and places unknown. It's usually shortened to simply Company of Merchant Adventurers. Their objective was to look for the northeastern route through the Arctic. The Company of Merchant Adventurers chose Sir Hugh Willoughby to lead its first expedition. He had no sailing experience, but he was a natural leader. Richard Chancellor was hired to serve as the navigator of the fleet of 3 ships, the Bona Esperanza under Willoughby, the Edward Bonaventure under Chancellor, and the Bona Confidencia under Cornelius Duforth. They left London on 10th of May, 1553. The English thought that a northern passage around Russia would be quicker and safer than the southerly routes the Spanish and Portuguese were following. Willoughby's fleet sailed up the northern coast of Norway, headed for the Arctic coast of Russia. Somewhere near the Lofoten Islands in modern-day Norway, his men were caught in a storm, and Chancellor's ship became separated from the others. Willoughby eventually reached Novaya Zemlya, a Russian archipelago in the Arctic Ocean. He decided to return to Norway as soon as he could. On his return voyage, Willoughby became trapped in sea ice. The expedition ended in disaster. Willoughby starved and froze to death with his men and their 2 ships. Meanwhile, the Edward Bonaventura, commanded by Richard Chancellor, reached the mouth of Dvina River in the White Sea, where he and his crew came into contact with Russian officials. The Russian Tsar got wind of Chancellor's arrival and invited him to Moscow. Chancellor's success in reaching Russian territory led to direct trade with England. Indeed, when Chancellor and his men returned to England, they carried with them a letter from the Tsar granting the English trading privileges in Russia. The Company of Merchant Adventurers then abandoned the search for the Northeast Passage and renamed itself the Muscovy Company to set up regular commercial relations with Russia. While other mariners would attempt the Northeast Passage in later years, Europeans realized they had really only two choices in their desire to reach Asia. They could sail east around Africa or head west as Columbus had done. While both options continue to be pursued, it became clear that the route around Africa was the most successful. The Dutch, like the English, also attempted several expeditions around Russia, and these also met with failure. So the Dutch sought information about the Portuguese route. By this time, the Portuguese had been sailing to Asia for roughly 100 years along routes they kept a closely guarded secret. Probably the greatest boon to Dutch aspirations in oceanic trade was the information obtained by a man named Jan Huygens van Linschoten. Thanks to some fortunate family connections, Linschoten had spent several years in the service of the Portuguese bishop in Goa. He wrote about his experience of living with the Portuguese in India, and he seems to have secretly kept notes about his voyage to India in a Portuguese ship. Linschoten eventually published a description of Portuguese India as Itinerario Voyage of Scheepvaart van Jan Huygens van Linschoten naar Oost of Portugeels-Indiën, which in English works out to Itinerary, Voyage or Travels of Jan Huygens van Linschoten to the East, or Portuguese Indies. Well, even prior to its publication in Amsterdam in 1595, the secret information the publication contained concerning the Portuguese route to Asia was probably the most important weapon available to the Dutch in their aspirations to insert themselves into the India trade. In addition to a fairly negative description of Portuguese Goa, the Itinerario included detailed nautical information necessary for a successful voyage from Europe to Asia around the Cape of Good Hope. This information appeared in a reisschrift, or travelogue, which was initially published separately, though later included in the Itinerario. The information Linschoten obtained from Portuguese and Spanish pilots was a closely guarded secret that could have been obtained only by a confidant of the administrative apparatus in Goa. It appears that the Portuguese were unaware that Linschoten had been secretly making copies of this nautical information, or that he had taken the information with him when he left Goa for Europe in 1589. The earliest Dutch voyage to the East Indies departed the Netherlands in early April 1595 under the general leadership of Cornelis de Houtman. So important was Linschoten's information that Cornelis de Houtman brought a manuscript copy of this soon-to-be-published account with him on that first voyage of the Dutch to Asia. Indeed, once Houtman's fleet had sailed to the South Atlantic, the pilots had only Linschoten's information to rely on. Within months, several Dutch fleets sailed to the Indies, launching a new chapter in the trade between Europe and Asia. By the end of the 16th century, the Portuguese were vying with the English and the Dutch for primacy in Asian waters. Some people have asked why Asians, and more specifically the Chinese, didn't succeed at discovering a sea route to Europe by this point in time. China did send out several maritime expeditions in the first half of the 15th century, and these were much larger than Europe's expeditions to Asia. But they didn't result in the kind of global trade network that European expansion did. The motivations for the Chinese voyages were very different from those of the Europeans, and that's why they didn't establish trade connections. China's relationship with the sea was probably as old as Europe's, and technologically, the Chinese had developed larger and better ships than the Europeans. But the impetus for Chinese seagoing voyages on a large scale was the dissolution of the Mongol Empire and the rise of the Ming Dynasty toward the end of the 14th century. Isolated from the rest of Eurasia, the Chinese emperor sought a way to project Chinese power and turned to the sea for his solution. He planned for a massive shipyard to be built at Nanjing and planted a forest of trees nearby for eventual harvest to build the ships. Over the following decades, the trees grew and political power shifted. One of the Chinese princes seized power from his nephew and became the emperor. One of the emperor's servants was a eunuch from Yunnan named Zheng He. He had fought on behalf of the young emperor when he was making his power grab. The new emperor rewarded his feisty servant by making him a confidant. And when the emperor decided it was time to put in motion the plan to send out maritime voyages to expend Chinese power, he appointed Zheng He to lead the expeditions. Zheng He's first voyage of 1405 was a massive undertaking. It consisted of 62 large ships, some as long as 600 feet. Compare this to the 62-foot Santa Maria, which was Columbus's flagship, and probably 100 smaller vessels. The fleet was manned by roughly 25,000 men. By comparison, Columbus's fleet had a complement of maybe 92 men. The Chinese first sailed to Vietnam and then across the Indian Ocean to Calicut. The ruler of Calicut presented fine and valuable gifts to Zheng He. And on the way back to China, the fleet sailed through the Strait of Malacca and established a base there, which it later used for trade voyages. Consider for a moment the differences in the way Zheng He's fleet was received in Calicut compared with the reception Da Gama had received earlier. While it's true that these voyages were about 90 years apart, the time that passed did not account for all of the differences. It's not hard to imagine how the ruler of Calicut could have reacted to the more than 100 huge ships appearing off his coast, not to mention the sheer size of the crew that would have been required to man them. In light of what would have been perceived as a threat from the Chinese, giving Zheng He valuable gifts, essentially trying to buy him off, seems a safe bet. Now consider what kind of reaction a few small Portuguese ships with a paltry crew and their paltry gifts might have received. Zheng He commanded several more voyages out into the oceans over the course of almost 30 years. But unlike the Portuguese, who were trying to establish trade relations, the Chinese were engaged in an exercise in power projection. Everywhere that Zheng He landed, he established tribute relationships with the local rulers. But aside from the curiosities Zheng He brought back to China, like exotic African animals, the giraffe and the zebra were particularly novel, the political tribute certainly never covered the costs of his voyages. Not long after his return from a final voyage in 1433, Zheng He died. And when a new emperor came to the throne as a child in 1435, court officials, unwilling to continue the expensive explorations, ended them once and for all. The logs of Zheng He's voyages were destroyed, essentially ending any further overseas aspirations the Chinese might have had. The conclusion of Chinese voyages occurred at just about the same time as the Portuguese were beginning their explorations down the coast of Africa, and that within 60 years would open a route to Asia. So what were some of the economic effects of exploration in the early medieval and early modern world? The explorations themselves certainly improved the world's stock of geographical knowledge, especially for Europeans. But the most important result of the voyages of exploration was that it paved the way for direct contact between Europe and the world's other continents, and between the other continents as well. Trade routes had crisscrossed the core areas of the Asian economy for centuries, if not millennia. But these core areas, Ming China, Mughal India, the Ottoman Empire, and even Tokugawa Japan, were relatively unaffected by the earliest European voyages. In a sense, then, the European voyages of the medieval and early modern period were part of a larger narrative of globalization that had been underway for centuries. The Europeans essentially created beachheads from which to engage in intense commercial activity on the fringes of the Eurasian economic network. Through these insertion points, Europeans integrated themselves into the commercial structure of Asia. They also became enmeshed in power struggles that predated their arrival. Eventually, Europeans would begin to exert economic and even political control over some Asian regions, which they rationalized through pretensions of religious and cultural superiority. In the Americas, by comparison, Europeans were confronted with a commercial system that was unrecognizable to them. Rather than integrating with or assimilating the commercial relationships of native peoples, the Europeans created an entirely new commercial system. And to exploit this new world, Europeans colonized the Americas, transforming them into a series of neo-Europes at the expense of native populations.